All right, so now we're moving on to something called factoring polynomials by grouping. Factoring by grouping. We use this when we start with 4 terms, not 3 terms like we've been using, but when you start with 4 terms. Factoring by grouping, it's very important that you follow these steps. If you follow the steps, it's pretty easy. It's very important, especially for the first step. It says group the first 2 terms together and the last 2 terms together. Notice I've got 4 terms. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. I'm going to group the first 2 terms together with using parentheses. It's very important that you put that second parenthesis in the right spot. So there's my open parenthesis. My closed parenthesis has to go after the second term, but before the sign of the third term. So I have to squeeze it in right here. And now, do not do this, because now you've got a plus sign between them, and that is not what's going on here. I'm going to take the next open parenthesis and let it kind of kiss the closed parenthesis from the other group. So I've split this into x cubed plus 7x squared times 2x plus 14, and that's a positive 2x. So that's the first step. That's a very important step. So now you're going to kind of treat it as 2 separate or 2 separate problems, 2 separate polynomials, this polynomial and this polynomial. Now you're going to, actually a binomial, you're going to factor out the GCF from each one of them. So treat them separately. So looking at x cubed plus 7x squared, the GCF for these 2 terms is an x squared. So watch, I'm going to write x squared. I'm factoring out the x squared. I'm going to open parentheses. And again, I'm only looking at this. If I factor out an x squared from both of these terms, then what I'm left with is x, and then x squared, that cancels, x plus 7. I'm left with x plus 7. So again, if you need to check it, then redistribute. X squared times x is x cubed. X squared times 7 is 7x squared. So I'm done with the first binomial. Now, right next to it, I'm going to factor out the GCF from that second binomial. So I see a 2x and I see a 14. Well, the only thing I can factor out of that is a positive 2. So I'm going to put plus 2, that's what I'm factoring out. And you do need to put that plus sign. You do need to put that plus sign. Normally, we don't have to write a positive sign or a plus sign when it's positive, but for this we do. I'm going to open parentheses. Now, I'm going to divide both of those terms by 2. So those 2's cancel, leaving me with x. The positive 14 divided by 2 is a positive 7. Notice that the binomials that are in the parentheses are exactly the same. It's not a coincidence. It's supposed to be like that. In fact, if they're not the same, then you've done something wrong. They have to be the same. So now, step 3 says the GCF from each binomial will become 1 factor. Oh, blah, blah, blah. This is how you're going to rewrite it. You're going to take the x plus 7, and you're going to copy and paste it as your first binomial. So there's my x plus 7. Now, I'm going to open parentheses again. I'm not going to put a sign or a symbol between these 2, and I'm going to take those leftover pieces, the x squared and the positive 2, and I'm going to make a new binomial out of it. So there's x squared, here's plus 2, this is factored. So we took a 4-term polynomial, and we factored it. Now, how do I know it's factored? Well, if I use FOIL and remultiply it, I should end up with what I started with. So let's do that. So we're using FOIL. We're going to use FOIL. So the first 2 terms, x times x squared is x cubed. And look, that was x cubed. Let's multiply the outers. So we've got a x times a 2, so that's a positive 2x. Now, it's not the second term, but it's okay. It is the third term. That positive 2x is the third term. The inners are going to be a positive 7 and then an x squared. So 7 times x squared is positive 7x squared, which is the second term. And finally, the last, L, 7 times 2 is 14. So this is what I got when I FOILed it. And technically, if I wrote it in standard form, I would have to reverse these two positions, leaving me with what I started with. So let's practice. It's not as bad as it seems. Number 1, I've got 4 terms. You can only factor by grouping if you have 4 terms. You start by grouping. So there's my open parenthesis. Notice I close the parenthesis immediately after the second term, but before the sign of the third term. Now, when I go to use my open parenthesis again, I'm going to make sure that I include the negative sign inside of my parentheses. So now it looks like 2 binomials that we would need to multiply. Now, I look only at the first binomial. I'm not even going to look at negative 2x minus 10 right now. I need to factor out a GCF only from these 2 terms. And it's looking like I have 3 goes into both of them. And I've got x cubed and x squared, so that means I can factor out a 3x squared from both of them. So let me do that. 3x squared, 3x squared. I'm going to open parentheses. 3x cubed divided by 3x squared is x. 15x squared divided by 3x squared. Well, the x squareds cancel. 15 divided by 3 is a 5. So after I factored out the GCF, I got 3x squared times x plus 5. That was only for the first 2 terms. Now I'm going to look at the second 2 terms. I've got a negative 2x minus 10. The GCF for this, if this is negative, you must factor out the negative version of the coefficient. So if you see a negative here, then you must put a negative here. The number that I'm going to factor out is a 2, because 2 is the greatest common factor of 2 and 10. So here's my negative 2. I cannot factor out an x for this. So I'm going to open parenthesis. I'm going to divide both of these. This is important. I'm going to divide both of these by a negative 2. So watch what happens. Remember, if you divide a negative by a negative, it turns into a positive. So negative 2 over negative 2 cancels, leaving me with a positive x. Here, a negative 10 divided by a negative 2 leaves me with a positive 5, which, if you remember what I said earlier, the binomials in the parentheses must be identical. So if for some reason you ended up with a negative sign right here, then you would have known you did something wrong, because it needs to match this one exactly. So that's really it. Now I just regroup them. So remember, you're going to use x plus 5 as one of the factors. So I've used those. And then I'm going to open parentheses, and I'm going to use these 2 leftover pieces to form another binomial. So 3x squared minus 2. And this is the answer. This is factored. I'm not going to take the time to refoil it, but if I did, I'd end up with what I started with. I'm just going to do one more because this is getting to be a long video. I'm going to go down to number 5. Number 5, because it's got 2 variables in it. So number 5, group, factor. Let's see here. It looks like I can factor out a 3y from both of these. So 3y, divide each one of these by a 3y. Actually, it's a positive 3y I'm dividing by. So 6 divided by 3 is 2. Y squared divided by y is y. A negative 3 divided by a positive 3 is a negative 1. The y's cancel, so we're left with a negative 1 as that term. Here we've got a 2yz minus z. The only thing I can factor out of this, and that's positive, so I need to put a positive right here. The only thing I can factor out is that z. So there's my z, open parenthesis. The z's cancel, leaving me with 2y. The z's cancel, leaving me with negative 1. So look, 2y minus 1, 2y minus 1, copy and paste that. For my other binomial, I'm going to use these leftover pieces. So that's a 3y plus z. And that would be factored. All right, that's the end of page 9.